This is from the story, page 193. After Solomon died, his own tribe of Judah automatically accepted his son Rehoboam as the next king. But much of the population, especially from the other tribes, had grown to resent Solomon's heavy taxation and conscripted labor for his grand projects. As representatives from all of Israel gathered to make Rehoboam king, they let their complaints be known. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. This is a complicated story. So grab your book. If I could do it in a fairy tale kind of way, here's how I would do it. Once upon a time, there was one big kingdom. Everyone together, all part of one purpose, working together, living together, being together. But soon there was a division. As people found their own preferences, they found their own leaders, and the disagreements grew. There was a northern kingdom, and now there is a southern kingdom. You know, people complicate things. This whole story is complicated, and it's all because of people. Let me tell you about us trying to go to dinner last night. This is how complicated my life is. I made supper. Nobody liked my supper. This happens 3 times a week. Nobody likes my supper. We decide we're going to pile in the car and go get some good supper. Then we realized, wait a minute, where is everybody? So BG said, I just ate Subway. I'm full. I'm not going. My daughter goes, where are you going? We tell her where we're going. She goes, I hate that place. I said, where are the twins? And we realized they're downtown on their skateboards and their bicycle. So we call them, you want to go to eat supper? And one said, yes, I'll hide my bicycle in the bush. So there she goes hiding her bicycle, come pick me up. Then we're trying to pile into the car the ones that are there, and Rudy gets a work call. And one thing about Rudy is if he's on a work call, he has to do this. And you can't do this in the car. This is what he does all day long. This is why he works from home. So he has to walk. So he has to get out of the car so he can do his pace out on Lee Street, in the middle of the street. And we're waiting for the work call to wrap up so we can go to dinner. And we finally make it to dinner. And by the time I'm there, I have lost my appetite. People are complicated. Let me remind you of the leader history that we've had so far. It started with King David. He was called a man after God's own heart. But as you remember, things got complicated with him, and he became a poor leader. Then he had a son, and his son's name was Solomon. Solomon was a wise king, we were told. But we learned last week, when Reverend Tim shared, that his wisdom did not always lead him to faithful choices. Solomon complicated things. Well, now we're getting to another complicated leadership because there's 2 men who both want the job. They both want to be king. And you find it in the story. So if you have a book of your own or there's one in the pew, you might want to flip to page 193. It's the very top of chapter 14. And here is where our complicated dilemma begins. It says on the top of page 193, God told a rising star in Solomon's administration named Jeroboam that he would be the future king. But look at the next paragraph. It says, after Solomon died, his own tribe of Judah automatically accepted his son, Rehoboam, as the next king. So people had to start deciding, who am I going to go with? There's a division. People had to choose. You've got Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, so he is the rightful heir. And so he became the king of the smaller part called Judah. Jeroboam was the rising star in Solomon's administration, and he became king of the larger part called Israel. So now instead of having one kingdom that all works together, now there are 2. Both kings promoted division. Both kings made it complicated. Thursday, I was trying to lead preschool chapel, and I realized as soon as I got started, my concept I was trying to share with these little 3- and 4-year-olds was too complicated. I was trying to teach them about how it is okay to be poor in spirit, because that's sometimes when Jesus meets us most beautifully, is when our hearts are broken. So I actually made a heart like this for preschool, and I was trying to share with them, and I said, when our hearts are broken, or we're divided, or we are hurting, God meets us where we are. Well, this little boy, you could tell he was waiting patiently the whole time through my talk, which I was trying to portray, but it just wasn't going well. And finally, he raised his hands, and I said, "Yes, what do you want?" And he said, "Do you love Jesus?" Well, I couldn't even understand what he said. So his teacher had to interpret. She said, "He's asking, do you love Jesus?" Well, if a 4-year-old has to ask you if you love Jesus, it's probably a sign that you did not communicate well, because you seem like someone that doesn't love Jesus. So I said, "Yes, I love Jesus very much." He said, "Then why did you tell his heart?" And I said, "I did not tear his heart. I was tearing my heart, and how Jesus heals us when we make things complicated and broken." And I realized the whole lesson was just too complicated. You know, there is wisdom out of the mouth of babes. I think it hurts God's heart when we're divided people. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but one of the meanings of Satan's name is divider. That's what his name means. It means that his goal and his purpose is to divide people. So I want us to test and see if that has happened. See if you can notice his work around the world. Have you noticed marriages in our day are often divided by divorce? Have you ever looked up the percentage rate of those that will stay married? I think we're at like 50% will and 50% won't. Satan also loves to divide families, and he knows if he can divide the marriage, then he certainly can divide the family. We know that Satan divides friendships. I'm going to ask by a showing of hands if you've ever been in a friendship that changed and shifted where you realize you're going to have to part ways and you really aren't friends with that person anymore. Has anybody had that happen? I have. It's division. How about business partners? All of us probably can think of a story where business partners started off together with great dreams, and then they had to kind of go their own certain paths. We know it happens in churches, that churches often become divided. It's always the work of Satan to divide and conquer. That's how he conquers. I want us to notice some things from the story this morning, this chapter 14, that hopefully will guide us with some good little truth nuggets about how division can be hurtful. The story says that it started with just disagreement. You know, a difference of opinion, disagreeing on a certain matter, doesn't have to divide. Sometimes our problem is that when I disagree with you, I tend to make you my enemy. And so I just assume that you're on the other side. If you look on page 193, it says this: "Much of the population did not want him as king, and they let their complaints be known." You know, just because something's different and you disagree doesn't mean that we have to be divisive. Now, I know Lewisburg United Methodist, we are not complainers. When something's different, and we don't like it, or we have a different way that we think it should be done, we certainly don't do that. But I've heard other churches do. There is nothing wrong with having a difference of opinion. Where it goes wrong is when we become divisive in our spirit and we create an enemy. It's us against them. Let me give you an example. I got to go home and visit right after Christmas, and it was December 29th, and I was asked by my mom to speak at her Sunday school class. Now, let me tell you how that's complicated for me. I grew up in a denomination that does not honor or believe in women pastors, and her church is large. It's about 2,000 people. So her Sunday school class that she teaches is about 50 people, so it's a large group. And honest to goodness, I didn't really want to do it, because I remember that Sunday when I was about 17 or 18 years old in the Baptist church, you have to walk up the aisle, and I walked up the aisle not only to give my life over, but I said, I feel called to ministry. And the people that counsel you that sit on the front row, they didn't have anywhere on the box to check that for me. And so they said, we'll just check the prayer box, which I'm not sure if they were praying for me to change my mind or if they were praying, I'm not sure what they were praying for. So here she's asked me to go speak in front of some of these same folks that I remember weren't too excited about me being called to ministry. I'm thankful that my family, who also many of them hold to that women should not be pastors, I appreciate that my family still affirms me. And they validate my gifts, and they say, well, I tell you, you are a communicator, and they support me as an individual. After Sunday school, I think they felt my nerves. And this older gentleman came up to me and he sweetly said, "It is a crying shame we don't allow women pastors because I would sit underneath your teaching." It was the sweetest blessing that maybe even if it doesn't totally jive with him, that he wanted to be a blessing rather than me being the enemy. I wonder if we can disagree without having a spirit of division. There was a man who was trapped on an island. I guess you call him a castaway. And he'd been living there many years all by himself, alone on a deserted island, when finally a captain of a ship discovered him. And as he approached the shore where this guy had been stranded, he noticed there were 3 huts built on the beach. And so he asked the fella, he said, "I thought you were here all by yourself. Why are there 3 houses?" He said, "Oh no, see the first one is, this is my house. This is where I sleep. This hut in the middle, that's my church." And he said, "Oh, okay, well then who's in the 3rd house?" He said, "Oh, that's where I used to go to church." It happens. It happens. This story this morning is about how disagreements can turn into division when we create an enemy and assume that they're on the other side. We also learned from the story that it is important to listen to one another. On page 194, it says, Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him. Later in that same paragraph, it says, the king refused to listen. It is hard to listen to each other, isn't it? I asked Rudy, I said, "Okay, Rudy, I'm talking about listening for my sermon. Why don't you listen to me?" And he said, because I've heard it 3 times. He said, "Why don't you listen to me?" And I said, "Because if I sit and listen to your whole thing, you might think I agree with you." I don't know why we don't always listen to each other. Sometimes it's just because we'd rather talk. Sometimes we don't listen to each other because we get distracted with what we're getting ready to say or what we want to say or the point that I want to make. Sometimes it's hard to listen to each other because we don't think what they have to say is very interesting. But no matter why we don't always like to listen, I can ultimately say this. It's because whoever is not listening well is the one who's wanting to be in control. And in our story, it is no different. The king would not listen to the good advice. Division also happened in our story because of pride. You know, pride's kind of a difficult word because I understand that there's some importance to pride. If you look up the definition of pride, it just says a feeling of deep pleasure or satisfaction from one's own achievements. There's probably nothing wrong with saying, "I'm glad I was able to do that. I'm proud that we did that. I'm proud that that happened." But it is a slippery slope as we move from pride to arrogance. This is what the kings did. They went from saying, "I know what I'm doing," to, "I don't need anybody's help." Rehoboam told everyone, "I am going to do it my way." Now you can hear that. If he says, "I'm going to do it my way," that means we can watch him as he slippery slides from pride to arrogance. But then Jeroboam did it an interesting way. He too was full of pride. But what he did was he would look at Rehoboam and say, "Well, I am going to do it a better way." You know, sometimes when we spend too much time comparing ourselves to others, looking over your shoulder to see if you're doing it better or if you're doing it worse, what happens is as we compare, we begin to compete. In the story on page 196, the king said, "If I let my people go back to the temple in Jerusalem where they want to spend time with God, and they may give their allegiance to Rehoboam." In other words, I can't let them go back to where they came from because they may like it better. They became competitive. Jeroboam decided to make 2 golden calves for the Israelites, and that way they wouldn't have to travel back to the northern kingdom. They just worshiped the golden calves, and believe it or not, the Israelites fell for that. When we compare ourselves to others, it just leads to competition. And joy robbers are both. Competition and comparing are joy robbers, and it makes division. You know, back in the day when they had salesmen that would go door to door and knock on the door and try to sell something, I heard a funny story that there was a very clever salesman, who was able to close 100 sales using one line. All he would say is, "Let me show you something that several of your neighbors said that you could not afford." And he would sell them like hotcakes. Sometimes when we spend our time comparing, we begin competing, and that is division, just like in our story. Finally, another thing that of a way they kind of caused division was that both kings lived out of fear rather than faith. As the leaders lived in fear, guess what happened to the people? They began to live in fear. I want us to sort of check in with our own hearts on that. All of us sometimes live out of fear more than faith. And so I'm going to, in your mind, have you make a choice. I'm going to give you a couple of choices, and you decide which one fits best for you. When we're in a time of stress and we start to lean into fear, you will do one of the two things. You will try too hard, trying to control, becoming critical, seeking value from others, trying to collect people that agree with you. That's trying too hard. Or the opposite. You don't try at all. You retreat. You say, "I give up. I'm going to disengage. I'm taking my toys and going home." Both of those, trying too hard or not trying at all, are both signs of fear. Okay, here's another one. You may be living out of fear when you say yes when you really mean no, because you're afraid to disappoint people. You're willing to sacrifice your own heart and your own time and your own life because you want to please someone. Or it's the opposite. You say no when you mean yes. I'm afraid to take a risk. I'm afraid to follow my heart's yearning. I'm afraid to listen to that call of what God is saying for me to do next. Another sign of fear is if you procrastinate. If you avoid what feels hard, even though you know it would be the right thing to do. Or the opposite. Some folks who are in fear act in haste. They hurry up and try to fix it, and they rush to a plan, and they make a fast decision, and they don't think about how it affects other people. All of these are examples of how oftentimes we are living out of fear instead of stepping into life in faith. Both of our kings this morning promoted division. I get it. Sometimes division is unavoidable. We live in a fallen, broken world. The choir just sang a beautiful song about coming to God broken. Maybe we have to wait all the way till we go to glory to all really become one. But in the meantime, I think Rehoboam and Jeroboam gave us a few tips that we could practice. One of them is, just because I don't agree with you doesn't mean we're enemies. Another one is, listen to one another, even if it takes practice. Another thing we learned is pride, arrogance, thinking you know the only way will never serve you well. And finally, live life in faith, not in fear. Amen.